Sometimes the most broken people are the ones meant to heal others. Like the night a widowed mechanic heard screaming from a house he'd driven past 1,000 times and discovered to children who would teach him that family isn't about blood, it's about choosing to stay when everyone else walks away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If stories about unexpected miracles and the power of unconditional love move your soul, this one will change how you see second chances forever. Now let me tell you what really happened on that humid August night in Millbrook, Texas. The air conditioning in Marcus Chen's pickup truck had been broken for 3 weeks, but he couldn't afford to fix it. Not when the rent on his small auto repair shop was already 2 months behind, and the electric company had left their final notice taped to his apartment door that morning. He drove with the windows down, letting the thick summer air whip through his black hair as he made his way home from another 16-hour day spent trying to keep his failing business alive. Marcus had lived in Millbrook for 8 years, ever since he'd moved there with his wife Sarah to start fresh after his discharge from the Army. The town was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the same families had been running the same businesses for generations, and where outsiders like him were tolerated but never quite accepted. Sarah had loved it anyway, had seen potential in the faded storefronts and empty lots, had talked endlessly about the community they would build, the children they would raise, the life they would create together. That was before the cancer took her 18 months ago, leaving Marcus alone in a town that suddenly felt too small and too big all at once. Too small because everywhere he looked, he saw memories of her. Too big because without Sarah's warmth and endless optimism, the distances between him and everyone else seemed insurmountable. He turned onto Maple Street, the same route he'd taken every night for years, past the Methodist church with its tilting steeple, past the abandoned gas station that had been promising to reopen since he'd arrived, past the row of modest houses where hard-working families tried to make ends meet. It was nearly midnight, and most of the windows were dark, but as he approached the rundown 2-story house at the end of the block, he could see lights blazing in every room. The Hendricks place. Marcus had always gotten a bad feeling about that house, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way the yard was always perfectly maintained, while the house itself seemed to be slowly rotting from the inside out. Maybe it was how Dale Hendricks never made eye contact when they passed each other at the hardware store, or how his wife Linda spoke in that artificially sweet voice that made Marcus's skin crawl. Maybe it was the parade of children who came and went from that house, always arriving with social workers and leaving the same way, though he'd noticed they never seemed to stay very long. As his truck drew closer, Marcus could hear something that made him slow down and frown. Voices, loud voices, and underneath them, something else that made his blood run cold. Crying, not the frustrated tears of an overtired child, but the kind of desperate, terrified sobbing that spoke of real fear. He pulled over to the curb and rolled down his window, telling himself he was probably overreacting. The Hendricks were foster parents, after all. They were supposed to be helping kids. But as he sat there in the darkness, the sounds coming from that house painted a picture that made his stomach turn. "You think you can disrespect me in my own house?" Dale Hendricks' voice carried clearly through the thin walls, thick with rage and something darker. "You think because you're twins, you can gang up on me? I'll show you what happens when you don't follow the rules." The crying intensified, and Marcus could make out two distinct voices now. Children. Young children. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he heard the unmistakable sound of a belt being unbuckled. "Please, Mr. Hendricks," a small voice pleaded, high and thin with terror. "We didn't mean to break it. We were just trying to help with dinner." "Help." Linda Hendricks' voice joined the chorus, saccharine sweet, but with an edge that could cut glass. "You called destroying my good china helping. That set cost more than you two are worth." Marcus had heard enough. Before he could second-guess himself, he was out of the truck and striding up the cracked concrete path to the front door. His heart pounded as he raised his fist and knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the sudden silence that fell over the house. The door opened to reveal Dale Hendricks. A heavyset man in his 50s with thinning hair and small, mean eyes. He was still holding a thick leather belt in his right hand, and his face was flushed with exertion and anger. When he saw Marcus standing on his porch, his expression shifted quickly to one of forced friendliness. "Marcus, right? From the auto shop?" Dale's voice was carefully controlled now, but Marcus could see the fury still simmering just beneath the surface. "Kind of late for a house call, don't you think?" "I was driving by and heard some noise," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Thought maybe you folks might need some help with something." Dale's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Just dealing with some discipline issues. You know how kids can be, always testing boundaries." Behind Dale, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement. Two small figures huddled together at the top of the stairs, barely visible in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. Even from a distance, he could see they were holding each other, their faces streaked with tears and their clothes disheveled. "Actually," Marcus said, taking a step closer to the door, "I was wondering if I could use your phone. My truck broke down just up the street, and my cell's dead." It was a lie, but it was the first thing he could think of to get inside that house. Dale hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to get rid of Marcus and his need to maintain the facade of normalcy. "I suppose that would be all right," Dale said finally, stepping aside to let Marcus enter. "Phone's in the kitchen." As Marcus followed Dale through the living room, he took in the details of the house with the trained eye of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly during his time in the military. The furniture was expensive but gaudy, all shiny surfaces and uncomfortable angles. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, but Marcus noticed that none of them included children. The house was too clean, too perfect, like a showroom where real life wasn't allowed to leave any marks. In the kitchen, Linda Hendricks stood at the sink with her back to them, scrubbing dishes with violent efficiency. She was a thin woman with bleached blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and when she turned to acknowledge Marcus, her smile was as sharp as broken glass. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Linda, Marcus Chen," he replied, accepting her offered hand and trying not to flinch at her grip, which was surprisingly strong and held on just a beat too long. "The phone's right there on the wall," Dale said, pointing to an old rotary phone mounted beside the refrigerator. "Help yourself." As Marcus pretended to dial, he listened to the sounds of the house around him. Upstairs, he could hear quiet whispering, too soft to make out the words but urgent in tone. Somewhere, a floorboard creaked. Linda had returned to her dishes, but her movements were jerky and aggressive, and she kept shooting glances at Dale that Marcus couldn't quite read. "No answer," Marcus said after a few moments, hanging up the phone. "Mind if I try again in a few minutes? Sometimes it takes a while to get through to the towing company this time of night." Dale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. "Sure, no problem. You want some coffee while you wait?" "That would be great, thanks." As Linda busied herself with the coffee pot, Marcus positioned himself where he could see the staircase. After a few minutes, his patience was rewarded. Two small faces peered around the corner at the top of the stairs, and when they saw him looking back at them, they quickly ducked out of sight. But not before he got a good look at them. They were young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with the kind of ethereal beauty that marked them as twins even from a distance. Their dark hair hung in tangled curtains, round faces that were too thin, too pale, marked with the kind of wariness that no child should ever have to carry. But it was their eyes that hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Even in that brief glimpse, he could see they were filled with a bone-deep terror that spoke of horrors no adult should ever inflict on a child. "Those your foster kids?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice casual as he accepted the steaming mug Linda handed him. "Emma and Ethan Sullivan," Dale said, his tone suggesting the names left a bad taste in his mouth. "Twins. Been with us about 3 months now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Troubled children," Linda added with a theatrical sigh. "Very troubled. Their previous placements didn't work out, and now we're seeing why. They're destructive, disrespectful, prone to lying. We're really at our wits' end with them." Marcus nodded as if he understood, but inside, his anger was building to a dangerous level. He had seen enough in his years in the military to recognize the signs of abuse, and everything about the situation was setting off alarm bells in his head. The way Dale kept fingering that belt, the way Linda's eyes glittered with barely concealed malice when she talked about the children, the way the house felt charged with tension, like the air before a storm. "Must be challenging," Marcus said. "Foster care, I mean, takes a special kind of person." "Oh, it does," Linda agreed, settling into a chair across from him. "But we believe in helping children, don't we, Dale? Even the difficult ones. Someone has to teach them that actions have consequences." The way she said it made Marcus's skin crawl. There was something predatory in her expression, something that enjoyed the power she held over to helpless children. He forced himself to take a sip of the bitter coffee and smile. "That's admirable of you both," he said. "Not everyone would take on that kind of responsibility." Dale preened at the praise, his chest puffing out with self-importance. "Well, we've always believed in giving back to the community. These kids, they come from broken homes, broken families. They need structure, discipline. They need to learn that the world doesn't owe them anything." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps on the stairs drew everyone's attention. The twins appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, moving with the careful, silent steps of children who had learned that being noticed usually meant trouble. Up close, Marcus could see the full extent of what these children had endured. Emma, slightly taller and clearly the older of the two by a few minutes, had a purple bruise blooming along her left cheekbone and red marks around her wrists that looked suspiciously like rope burns. Her dark hair was matted and greasy, as if it hadn't been properly washed in weeks, and her clothes hung loose on her too thin frame. But despite everything, there was a fierce protectiveness in the way she positioned herself slightly in front of her brother, as if she could shield him from whatever was coming next. Ethan was smaller, more fragile looking, with the same dark hair and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take up half his face. His lower lip was split and swollen, and Marcus could see finger-shaped bruises on his upper arms where he'd clearly been grabbed and shaken. But what broke Marcus's heart was the way the boy clung to his sister's hand, the way his whole body trembled with barely contained fear. What are you two doing down here?" Dale's voice was deceptively calm, but Marcus could see the way both children flinched at the sound of it. "I thought I told you to stay in your room until morning." "We're thirsty," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady with the kind of courage that only came from having no other choice. "Please, can we just get some water?" Linda laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Water? After what you did tonight? I think you can wait until morning." Marcus watched as Emma's free hand clenched into a fist at her side, saw the way she lifted her chin just a fraction of an inch in defiance. This little girl had spirit, he realized. Despite everything they had done to her, despite the fear and the pain and the hopelessness of her situation, she hadn't been completely broken yet. "Actually," Marcus said, standing up from his chair with deliberate casualness, "I could use a glass of water myself. Mind if I get one for all of us?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. Dale and Linda exchanged a look that spoke volumes, but with Marcus standing right there, they couldn't very well refuse without looking like monsters. Dale's hand twitched toward the belt he'd set on the counter, but he managed to control himself. "Of course," Linda said through gritted teeth, her smile so fake it looked like it might crack her face in half. "Glasses are in the cabinet above the sink." Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to think. As he filled 3 glasses with water from the tap, he could feel the children's eyes on him, could sense their confusion at this unexpected kindness from a stranger. When he turned back around, he knelt down to their level and offered them each a glass. "Here you go," he said gently, his voice pitched low and calm. "Drink as much as you need." Emma took her glass with shaking hands, her eyes never leaving his face. There was something in her expression that made Marcus's chest tight, a desperate kind of hope that she was fighting not to show. Ethan was more hesitant, glancing between Marcus and the Hendricks. as if he expected this kindness to be snatched away at any moment. As the children drank, Marcus noticed other details that made his anger burn hotter. Their clothes were too small and clearly secondhand, with stains and holes that spoke of neglect. Emma's shoes were held together with duct tape, and Ethan wasn't wearing any shoes at all. Both children were painfully thin, the kind of thin that came from not getting enough food, not just from being naturally small. "Thank you," Emma whispered when she finished her water. The words so quiet Marcus almost missed them. "You're welcome," he replied, and something in his tone must have reached her, because for just a moment, her carefully constructed walls cracked, and he saw the frightened little girl underneath. "All right, that's enough," Dale said, his patience clearly at an end. "Back upstairs, both of you, and I don't want to hear another sound from your room tonight." The children set down their glasses and turned to go, but Marcus found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Wait," he said, standing up. "I'm sorry, but I have to ask, are you kids all right?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Dale's face went red with fury, and Linda's artificial smile finally slipped completely. "I beg your pardon," Linda said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "It's just," Marcus continued, knowing he was crossing a line, but unable to stop himself. "They look hurt, that bruise on Emma's face and Ethan's lip. I was just wondering if maybe they needed to see a doctor or something." "Those children are accident-prone," Dale said, his voice deadly calm. "Always running into things, falling down. Kids that age, you know how it is." Marcus looked down at the twins again, saw the way they pressed closer together, saw the fear in their eyes intensify. Emma was shaking her head almost imperceptibly, a tiny movement that screamed louder than words could have. "Don't make it worse," she was saying. "Please don't make it worse." But Marcus had seen too much, heard too much. Every instinct he had was screaming that these children were in immediate danger, that walking away now would be tantamount to signing their death warrants. He thought of Sarah, of how she had always said that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when it was easy, but what they did when it was hard, when it mattered. "You know what?" Marcus said, pulling out his cell phone. "I think I should call my brother-in-law. He's a pediatrician. Maybe he could take a look at them just to be safe." It was another lie, but it had the desired effect. Dale's face went from red to purple, and his hand moved instinctively to his belt. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Right now, actually," Marcus said, his own voice hardening. "I think I should call the police." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Linda laughed, high and shrill. "On what grounds?" she demanded. "We haven't done anything wrong. These children are known liars, troublemakers. They've been in and out of foster homes their entire lives. No one wants them because they're damaged goods." Marcus felt something snap inside him at those words. Damaged goods. As if these children were broken toys instead of human beings who deserved love and protection. "Maybe," he said, his voice steady despite the rage coursing through his veins. "But I know what I've seen and heard tonight, and I know what those injuries look like." Dale took a step toward him, and Marcus tensed, ready for a fight. But before anything could happen, Emma stepped forward. "Please don't," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with a desperate kind of bravery. "Please don't make trouble for us. We'll be good, we promise. We won't break anything else." The way she said it, the resigned acceptance in her voice, broke something in Marcus's chest. This little girl was trying to protect him, trying to save him from getting involved in her nightmare, because she had learned that adults who tried to help usually just made things worse. "Sweetheart," Marcus said, kneeling down again so he was at her eye level. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." Tears spilled down Emma's cheeks, and for the first time since he'd entered the house, Ethan spoke. "Nobody believes us," he whispered, his voice so small and broken that Marcus had to strain to hear him. "They say we're liars. They say we make up stories to get attention. I believe you," Marcus said simply, and the way both children's faces lit up with shocked hope made his heart ache. That was apparently the last straw for Dale Hendricks. With a roar of rage, he lunged forward, grabbing Ethan by the arm and yanking him away from Marcus with such force that the little boy cried out in pain. "That's enough," Dale shouted. "Get out of my house right now, or I'm calling the police myself." But Marcus was already pulling out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. "That's a great idea," he said. "Let's call them together." As the phone rang in his ear, Marcus watched Dale's face cycle through fury, fear, and calculation. Linda had gone very still, her eyes darting between her husband and the children as if she was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. 911, what's your emergency? "I need to report suspected child abuse," Marcus said clearly, his eyes never leaving the Hendricks faces. Two children are in immediate danger. What happened next would haunt Marcus for years to come. Dale, realizing that his world was about to come crashing down, made a grab for his belt. But instead of going after Marcus, he turned toward the children with a snarl of pure rage. "You little bastards," he hissed. "This is all your fault." Marcus moved without thinking, his military training taking over. He stepped between Dale and the twins, one hand reaching out to push the children behind him while the other stayed on the phone with the 911 operator. "Sir, I need you to calm down," the operator was saying. "Officers are on their way. Can you tell me exactly what's happening?" "Two children are being threatened by their foster father," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "I'm trying to protect them, but the situation is escalating." Dale swung the belt toward Marcus, who dodged easily and grabbed the man's wrist, using his superior strength and training to force him back. "Don't make this worse for yourself," Marcus warned. "The police are already coming." Behind him, he could hear Emma and Ethan crying, could feel their small hands clutching at his shirt. Linda was screaming something about lawsuits and false accusations, but Marcus tuned her out, focused entirely on keeping the children safe until help arrived. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before the sound of sirens filled the air when the first officer walked through the front door. Marcus had never been so relieved to see anyone in his life. "I'm Officer Rodriguez," the policeman said, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Someone called about a domestic disturbance. These people are abusing these children," Marcus said immediately, stepping aside so the officer could see Emma and Ethan, who were still clinging to each other in terror. "That's a lie," Linda shrieked. "This man broke into our house and threatened us. He's trying to kidnap our foster children." Officer Rodriguez looked between the adults, then knelt down to the children's level. Marcus watched as the man's expression hardened when he got a good look at their injuries. "Can you tell me your names?" Rodriguez asked gently. "Emma Sullivan," Emma whispered. "This is my brother Ethan. And how did you get these bruises?" Emma glanced fearfully at the Hendricks, then back at the officer. "I fell down," she said automatically, the lie so practiced it was clearly something she'd been forced to say many times before. But Rodriguez was experienced enough to read between the lines. "Ethan, what about your lip?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and he looked at his sister as if asking for permission. Emma, seeing something in the officer's face that gave her hope, nodded almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Hendricks hit me," Ethan whispered, "with his belt, because I couldn't eat all my dinner." The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez stood up slowly, his hand moving to his radio. "I need CPS down here right away," he said, "and I need another unit for backup." What followed was a blur of activity. More police officers arrived, along with a social worker who looked like she'd seen too much and cared too little. The Hendricks were questioned separately, their stories full of holes and contradictions. The children were examined by a paramedic who documented their injuries with grim efficiency. Marcus found himself being questioned as well, explaining how he'd come to be at the house, what he'd seen and heard. Throughout it all, he kept one eye on Emma and Ethan, who sat huddled together on the front porch, looking lost and terrified despite being surrounded by people who were supposed to help them. "They'll be placed in emergency foster care tonight," the social worker told him as the investigation wound down. "We'll find them a temporary placement until we can figure out something more permanent." Marcus watched as the woman approached the children, saw the way they shrank away from her despite her attempts to appear kind and unthreatening. He thought about what Linda had said earlier, about the twins being damaged goods that no one wanted. He thought about the fear in their eyes, the resignation in their voices, the way they had tried to protect him even when they couldn't protect themselves. What if I took them? He heard himself saying. The social worker turned to look at him, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Excuse me," I said. "What if I took them? Tonight, I mean, as emergency placement." The woman's expression was skeptical. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, emergency foster placement requires extensive background checks, home studies, training. You can't just decide to take into traumatized children on a whim." "It's not a whim," Marcus said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I have a clean record, a stable job, a home. I was the one who called this in. I'm not going to hurt them. That's not the point," the social worker said patiently. "These children need specialized care. They've been through severe trauma. They need to be placed with certified foster families who have experience dealing with abuse cases." Marcus looked over at Emma and Ethan again, saw the way they were watching the conversation with wide, fearful eyes. They knew they were being talked about, being shuffled around like pieces on a chessboard, and the helplessness in their faces made his chest tight. "Where will you place them?" he asked. The social worker hesitated. "We have a few options. There's a group home about an hour away that has space. Or we might be able to find a family willing to take them on short notice, a group home." Marcus repeated flatly. "You mean an institution? It's not ideal," the woman admitted, "but sometimes with emergency placements, especially with older children who have behavioral issues." "They don't have behavioral issues," Marcus interrupted. "They have trauma from being abused by the people who were supposed to protect them." The social worker's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Chen, I understand you want to help. What you did tonight was very brave, but taking in foster children is a huge responsibility, and these particular children are going to need a lot of care and patience." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He thought about Sarah, about the children they had planned to have together, about the empty rooms in his small apartment that echoed with dreams that would never come true. He thought about his failing business, his mounting debts, his own grief and depression that he could barely manage on his own. Then he looked at Emma and Ethan again, and saw Emma whisper something in her brother's ear that made him nod and sit up a little straighter. Even in the midst of their nightmare, she was taking care of him, protecting him, being the adult when all the actual adults had failed them. "What would I need to do?" he asked. The social worker blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry. To become certified for emergency placement." "What would I need to do?" "Well, there's paperwork, background checks, a home inspection, interviews, training classes." She trailed off, seeing the determination in his face. "Mr. Chen, the process usually takes months, but there must be some kind of emergency protocol," Marcus pressed. "Some way to fast-track it when children are in immediate need." The woman was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "There's a provisional certification process for emergency situations," she said finally, "but it would require interviews with your references, a home inspection, and you'd have to agree to ongoing supervision and support services." "How long would that take?" "If we started first thing tomorrow morning, maybe 72 hours. Marcus felt his heart sink. 72 hours of these children being shuffled through the system, probably separated, probably scared and alone in unfamiliar places with strangers who saw them as problems to be managed rather than children, to be loved. "Mr. Chen," a small voice called from behind him. He turned to see Emma standing a few feet away, having apparently slipped away from the paramedic who had been watching her. Up close, in the harsh light of the street lamps, her injuries looked even worse than they had inside the house. "Are they going to separate us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The directness of the question, the matter-of-fact way she asked it, hit Marcus like a physical blow. This little girl had learned not to hope for too much, had learned that the adults in her life would always choose what was convenient over what was right. "Not if I can help it," Marcus said, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. Emma studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was Telling the truth, Ethan's scared, she said finally. He doesn't like new places. What about you? Marcus asked gently. Are you scared too? Emma's chin lifted in that gesture of defiance he was beginning to recognize. I take care of Ethan, she said simply, as if that answered everything. And maybe it did. Maybe that was all Marcus needed. To know about this fierce, brave little girl who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had learned to be strong because no one else would be strong for her. Emma, he said carefully, what if you and Ethan came to stay with me for a while? Just until they can find you a good family? Emma's eyes widened in shock. You mean together? They wouldn't split us up. Not on my watch, Marcus said firmly. For the first time since he'd seen her, Emma's carefully controlled expression cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she covered her mouth with her hands as if she was afraid to let herself hope. Why? She whispered through her fingers. Why would you want us? Linda said we're too much trouble. She said nobody wants broken kids. Marcus felt his anger at the Hendricks flare up again, but he pushed it down. These children needed calm, needed safety, needed someone who could be steady and reliable in the chaos of their lives. You're not broken, he said simply. You're just hurt, and hurt things can heal if they're given the right care. Emma stared at him for a long moment, then turned and ran back to her brother. Marcus watched as she whispered urgently in Ethan's ear, saw the way the little boy's face lit up with something that might have been hope. The social worker approached him again, her expression thoughtful. You're serious about this, she said. It wasn't a question. Dead serious, Marcus confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. Let me make some calls, she said. See what we can do about expediting the process. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself caught up in a whirlwind of paperwork and phone calls. The social worker, whose name was Jana Morrison, turned out to be more sympathetic than her initial demeanor had suggested. She made call after call, pulling strings and calling in favors, working the system in ways that Marcus didn't entirely understand but was deeply grateful for. The judge has agreed to grant you emergency provisional custody, Jana told him. Around 3 in the morning, it's highly unusual, but given the circumstances and your background, she's willing to make an exception. You'll have 48 hours to complete the required paperwork and inspections. Marcus felt a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. What happens after 48 hours? If everything checks out, you'll get temporary custody. Well, we work on finding a more permanent placement, Jana said. I have to warn you, Mr. Chen, this is not a commitment to permanent adoption. These children will still be in the system, and our goal is still to find them a forever family. Marcus nodded, understanding, but not really caring about the long-term implications. All that mattered right now was making sure Emma and Ethan were safe, that they weren't separated, that they had at least one adult in their lives who would choose them over convenience. There's one more thing, Jana said. Given the trauma these children have experienced, they're going to need counseling, probably medication for anxiety and depression. Ethan in particular seems to have some developmental delays that will need to be addressed. Are you prepared for that level of care? Marcus thought about his tiny apartment with its 1 bedroom and leaky roof. He thought about his failing business and his mountain of debt. He thought about his own grief and depression, about the fact that he could barely take care of himself most days. Then he looked over at Emma and Ethan, who were asleep on the back seat of a police cruiser, curled up together like 2 lost puppies, even in sleep. Emma had one protective arm around her brother, and Ethan's hand was fisted in her shirt as if he was afraid she might disappear. I'm prepared, Marcus said, as the sun began to rise over Millbrook. Marcus found himself driving home with 2 sleeping children in the back seat of his pickup truck. They had woken up long enough for the paramedic to check them over one more time and for Jana to explain what was happening. But exhaustion had claimed them before they'd even left the Hendricks neighborhood. Marcus drove slowly, careful not to hit any potholes or take turns too sharply. In the rearview mirror, he could see Emma's face, relaxed in sleep but still showing the marks of everything she'd endured. She looked so young, so vulnerable, and Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. What had he done? What had he gotten himself into? He didn't know anything about raising children, let alone children who had been through the kind of trauma Emma and Ethan had experienced. He didn't have the space, the money, or the emotional resources to take care of two kids who would undoubtedly need more than he could give them. But as he pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex and saw Emma stir in the back seat, her eyes opening to meet his in the mirror, he knew he had made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face, it had to be better than leaving these children to navigate the system alone. "Are we here?" Emma asked quietly, careful not to wake her brother. "We're here," Marcus confirmed. Turning off the engine, Emma looked around at the modest apartment complex with its peeling paint and overgrown landscaping. It wasn't much, but it was honest in its shabbiness. Nothing like the false perfection of the Hendricks house. "Is this where you live?" she asked. "This is where we live," Marcus corrected gently, and the smile that spread across Emma's face was worth every sleepless night he knew lay ahead of them. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Marcus's apartment, casting weak shadows across the small living room, where Emma and Ethan had spent their first night away from the Hendricks house. Marcus had given them his bed while he took the couch, but sleep had been elusive for all of them. Every creak of the building, every car door slamming in the parking lot, every neighbor's television had sent the children into high alert, their bodies tensed and ready to flee or fight. Marcus woke to the sound of quiet whispering from the bedroom. He padded barefoot across the worn carpet and peered through the slightly open door to see Emma and Ethan sitting on the edge of the bed, their heads close together as they spoke in hushed tones. They had slept in their clothes from the night before, and Emma's hair was a tangled mess that she kept brushing away from her face with nervous fingers. "What if he changes his mind?" Ethan was saying, his voice thick with the remnants of sleep and worry. "What if he decides we're too much trouble and sends us back?" Emma's response was swift and fierce. "He won't," she said with a conviction that made Marcus's chest tight. "He's different. Did you see how he looked at us? Not like we were problems to solve, but like we were people who mattered." Marcus retreated to the kitchen, not wanting to intrude on their private moment, but carrying their words with him. Like a weight in his chest, the responsibility of their trust felt enormous, especially when he wasn't entirely sure he could live up to it. His kitchen was barely functional, with a temperamental refrigerator that wheezed and groaned, a stove with 2 working burners, and cabinets that held little more than instant coffee, canned soup, and a loaf of bread that was quickly approaching its expiration date. He opened the refrigerator and stared at its meager contents, trying to figure out what constituted an appropriate breakfast for the traumatized children. There were 3 eggs, a carton of milk that might or might not still be good, and a package of bacon that had been there so long he couldn't remember buying it. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until he could get to the grocery store. As he cracked the eggs into a bowl, Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah and how naturally she had moved through domestic spaces, how she had always seemed to know exactly what people needed before they knew it themselves. She would have known what to say to comfort to frightened children, would have known how to make them feel safe and wanted. Marcus felt like he was stumbling through a foreign country without a map, hoping his good intentions would be enough to make up for his inexperience. The sound of small footsteps on the linoleum made him turn around. Emma stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her hand protectively wrapped around Ethan's wrist. Both children looked like deer caught in headlights, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Good morning," Marcus said softly, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "Did you sleep okay?" Emma nodded, though the dark circles under her eyes suggested otherwise. Ethan said nothing, just pressed closer to his sisters, sighed and stared at Marcus with those enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge for someone so young. "I was just making some breakfast," Marcus continued, gesturing to the eggs he'd been scrambling. "Nothing fancy, but there's enough for everyone. Are you hungry?" Both children nodded, though Marcus noticed they remained in the doorway rather than coming into the kitchen. They were keeping their escape route clear, he realized, ready to run if things went bad. The thought made his heart ache for what they must have endured to develop such survival instincts. "You can sit at the table if you want," Marcus offered. nodding toward the small round table that took up most of his dining area. "Or you can just watch me cook, whatever makes you comfortable." After a moment of silent communication between the twins, Emma led Ethan to the table. They sat close together on one side, leaving the other chairs empty, and watched Marcus's every movement with the kind of hypervigilance that spoke of months, or maybe years of having to anticipate adult moods and reactions. Marcus worked slowly and deliberately, narrating his actions as he went. "Just scrambling some eggs here, adding a little milk to make them fluffy. Your breakfast should be ready in just a few minutes." He kept his voice calm and steady, the way he might talk to a spoked horse, and gradually he saw some of the tension leave the children's shoulders. When he set plates of eggs and toast in front of them, Emma whispered, "Thank you," so quietly he almost missed it. Ethan said nothing, but he clutched his fork like it was a lifeline and began eating with the quick, efficient movements of someone who had learned never to take food for granted. Marcus sat across from them with his own plate, but he found himself eating very little instead. He watched as Emma carefully divided her eggs in half and slid the larger portion onto Ethan's plate when she thought Marcus wasn't looking. The gesture was so automatic, so practiced, that it was clear she had been supplementing her brother's meals for a long time. "Emma," Marcus said gently, "there's plenty of food. You don't have to give yours to Ethan." Emma froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, and Marcus saw fear flash across her face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to be greedy. I was just—" "You weren't being greedy," Marcus interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "I was just saying that there's enough for both of you to have full plates. You shouldn't have to go hungry so Ethan can eat." Emma stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of test. Finally, she pulled her eggs back to her own side of the plate, but continued to eat with careful, measured bites, as if she was afraid the food might disappear if she enjoyed it too much. After breakfast, Marcus showed them around the small apartment, trying to see it through their eyes. The living room was barely large enough for his second-hand couch and the ancient television that picked up 3 channels on a good day. The bathroom was cramped but clean, with a shower that had decent water pressure as long as you didn't mind the occasional cold spike. His bedroom was modest, with just enough space for a double bed and a dresser that had seen better days. "This is where you'll be sleeping," Marcus said, opening the door to what had once been intended as a home office, but had never been used for much more than storage. It was small and windowless, with barely enough room for the air mattress he'd hastily purchased that morning, but it was private, and it was theirs. Emma looked around the tiny space and then up at Marcus with an expression of wonder that made his throat tight. "We get our own room?" she asked. "Of course," Marcus said. "Everyone needs their own space." "We've never had our own room before," Ethan spoke up, his voice small but clear. "We always had to share with other kids, or sleep on couches, or sometimes on the floor." The casual way he said it, as if sleeping on floors was just a normal part of childhood, made Marcus's hands clench into fists at his sides. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to push down the rage that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he thought about what these children had endured. "Well, this is your room now," Marcus said, "for as long as you're here." Over the next few days, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what he had taken on. Emma and Ethan moved through his apartment like ghosts, careful not to touch anything without permission, quick to apologize for the smallest infractions, constantly watching and waiting for the other shoe to drop. They hoarded food in their pockets and under their pillows, a behavior that broke Marcus's heart even as he understood its necessity. They flinched when he moved too quickly or spoke too loudly, and they monitored his moods with the intensity of meteorologists tracking a dangerous storm. But slowly, carefully, trust began to build between them. Marcus learned that Emma was fiercely intelligent, with a quick mind for numbers and a memory that retained everything she read. She had been taking care of Ethan for so long that mothering him was as natural as breathing, and she approached every new situation with an analytical mind that tried to identify threats and opportunities with equal measure. Ethan, once he began to open up, revealed himself to be an artist at heart. He drew constantly, his small hands creating intricate pictures with whatever materials he could find. His drawings were windows into his inner world, sometimes dark and frightening, sometimes bright with hope and possibility. He had a gentle soul that had somehow survived everything life had thrown at him, and his quiet observations about the world around him often contained wisdom that surprised Marcus with its depth. The first real breakthrough came on their 4th day together. Marcus had been working in his small home office, trying to catch up on paperwork for his auto shop, when he heard a commotion from the kitchen. He rushed out to find Ethan standing in front of the open refrigerator, tears streaming down his face, while Emma tried desperately to calm him down. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, immediately dropping to his knees so he was at their eye level. "The milk," Emma said, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's gone bad, and Ethan was just trying to pour some for his cereal. And now he thinks you're going to be mad because he wasted food." Marcus looked at the carton of milk that had indeed soured, probably sometime during the night, and then at Ethan's terrified face. The little boy was shaking with the force of his sobs, clearly expecting punishment for something that wasn't his fault. "Oh, buddy," Marcus said softly, reaching out slowly to touch Ethan's shoulder. When the boy didn't pull away, Marcus pulled him into a gentle hug. "It's okay. Milk goes bad sometimes. It's not your fault, and I'm not mad. But it's wasted." Ethan hiccuped against Marcus's chest. "Linda always said wasting food was the worst thing you could do. She said it meant you were ungrateful and spoiled." Linda was wrong about a lot of things, Marcus said firmly. "Milk costs maybe $3. Do you know what's worth way more than $3 to me?" Ethan pulled back to look at him, his eyes still wet with tears. "You," Marcus said simply. "You and Emma are worth more to me than all the milk in the world. So if every carton of milk in this apartment goes bad, I don't care, as long as you two are okay. Nothing else matters." The transformation in Ethan's face was immediate and profound. The fear dissolved, replaced by something Marcus had rarely seen there before: pure, uncomplicated relief. And for the first time since they'd arrived, Ethan smiled a real smile, not the careful, guarded expression he usually wore around adults. "Can we go get more milk?" Ethan asked. "We can do better than that," Marcus said, standing up and extending his hands to both children. "We can go grocery shopping and get everything we need to make this place feel like home." The trip to the grocery store was an education for Marcus in just how little these children had been given throughout their lives. Emma and Ethan walked through the aisles with wide eyes, overwhelmed by the abundance of choices and clearly uncertain about what they were allowed to want. When Marcus told them to pick out cereals they liked, they stared at the colorful boxes as if they were foreign artifacts. "We usually just had oatmeal," Emma said quietly, "or whatever was on sale." "Well, today you get to choose," Marcus said. "Pick whatever looks good to you." It took nearly 20 minutes for them to decide, and even then they chose the most basic options available, as if they were afraid to ask for too much. Marcus supplemented their choices with items he thought they might enjoy, including a package of chocolate chip cookies that made Ethan's eyes light up with wonder. In the produce section, Marcus watched as Emma carefully examined each apple and banana, looking for bruises or imperfections. When he asked her what she was doing, she explained that the Hendricks had taught them to only pick the damaged fruit because it was cheaper and they weren't worth the expense of perfect produce. "That's not how it works here," Marcus said gently. "We're going to get the best fruit we can find because you deserve the best." Emma looked at him skeptically. "Even if it costs more?" "Especially if it costs more," Marcus confirmed, and the smile that spread across her face was like watching the sun come up. Back at the apartment, they spent the afternoon putting away groceries and rearranging the kitchen to accommodate their new family dynamic. Marcus moved things to lower shelves so the children could reach them, and he showed them where everything went so they would feel comfortable helping themselves when they were hungry. "You don't have to ask permission to get food," he told them as they worked. "If you're hungry, eat. If you're thirsty, drink. This is your home now, and you shouldn't have to ask for basic necessities." The concept seemed foreign to them, but Marcus could see them processing it, filing it away with all the other new rules they were learning about how families were supposed to work. That evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie on Marcus's ancient television. Ethan curled up against his side while Emma maintained careful distance. On the other end of the couch, the movie was a Disney film that Marcus had rented from the gas station down the street. Something light and cheerful that he hoped would help the children relax. Halfway through the movie, during a particularly funny scene, Ethan laughed out loud. It was the first time Marcus had heard him laugh, and the sound was so pure and joyful that it brought tears to his eyes. Emma noticed his reaction and scooted a little closer, close enough that their knees were almost touching. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "I'm perfect," Marcus said, and meant it. The next morning brought a knock at the door that made all three of them freeze. Marcus had been expecting Jana Morrison for her follow-up visit, but he could see the anxiety spike in both children as they heard the unfamiliar voice asking for entry. "It's just the social worker," Marcus explained as he went to answer the door. "Remember? She's here to check on you and make sure everything is going okay." Janet entered with her clipboard and professional smile, but Marcus could see her taking note of every detail of the apartment. She spoke with the children separately, asking them how they were adjusting and whether they felt safe and cared for. Marcus waited in the kitchen, trying not to pace while she conducted her interviews. When she finished, Janet sat down with Marcus at the kitchen table while Emma and Ethan retreated to their room. "They seem to be adjusting well," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "Ethan is still very withdrawn, but that's to be expected given his trauma history. Emma is clearly the protector in their relationship, which is both a strength and a concern. We don't want her to feel like she has to take care of everything. She's been taking care of him for so long. I think it's become part of her identity," Marcus said. "I'm trying to show her that she can be a kid too, but it's going to take time." Janet nodded. "Have you given any thought to counseling?" "Both. Children would benefit from trauma therapy, and there are some excellent programs specifically designed for sibling pairs." Marcus had been thinking about it constantly, but the reality of his financial situation made professional help feel impossibly out of reach. His auto shop was barely breaking even, and adding 2 children to his expenses had stretched his budget beyond its limits. "I want to get them help," he said carefully, "but I need to figure out the logistics first." Janet studied his face for a moment, then pulled out another form from her folder. "There are state programs that can help with therapeutic services for foster children," she said. "It's not charity, Marcus. It's part of what these kids are entitled to after what they've been through." Relief flooded through Marcus as he realized that getting the children help wouldn't mean choosing between their emotional well-being and keeping a roof over their heads. "How do I apply?" Over the next hour, Janet walked him through the paperwork and explained the various services available to them. In addition to individual and family therapy, there were educational assessments to help determine if the children needed additional academic support, medical examinations to address any ongoing health issues from their abuse, and even recreational programs designed to help traumatized children learn to play and socialize normally. "It sounds overwhelming," Janet acknowledged as she packed up her papers, "but you don't have to do everything at once. The most important thing right now is that they feel safe and stable. Everything else can be built on that foundation." After she left, Marcus found Emma and Ethan sitting on their air mattress, playing a quiet game with some toy cars that a neighbor had donated when word got around about his new house guests. The sight of them actually playing like normal children, made something tight in his chest loosen just a fraction. "How did it go?" Emma asked, looking up at him with those serious eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Good," Marcus said, sitting down on the floor beside them. "She thinks you're both doing really well here." "Are we going to stay?" Ethan asked, his voice small and hopeful. Marcus looked at both of them, these 2 children who had been through more than most adults could handle, who had somehow maintained their capacity for hope and love despite everything. The smart thing, the practical thing, would be to hedge his bets, to remind them that this was temporary and that they shouldn't get too attached. But looking at their faces, seeing the fragile trust that was beginning to bloom there, Marcus knew he couldn't give them anything less than the complete truth. "I hope so," he said. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay here with me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since he'd known her, they looked like tears of relief rather than fear. She launched herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him over, and a moment later Ethan joined them. The three of them tangled together on the floor of the tiny room in a hug that felt like coming home. The days began to take on a rhythm that felt almost normal. Marcus would wake early to get the children ready for their appointments with various doctors and therapists, then drop them off at the community center's summer program while he worked. At his shop, the program was free for children in foster care, and it gave Emma and Ethan a chance to interact with other kids their age in a supervised, supportive environment. At first, both children clung to each other and avoided interacting with the other kids, but gradually Marcus began to see signs of progress. Emma started participating in the reading groups, her natural intelligence and love of books making her a favorite of the volunteer teachers. Ethan gravitated toward the art stations, where he could lose himself in drawing and painting for hours at a time. The community center's director, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, pulled Marcus aside one afternoon to share her observations. "Emma is incredibly bright," she said, "but she's also incredibly anxious about Ethan. She checks on him constantly, and she gets agitated if she can't see him. It's clear she's been his primary caregiver for a long time." Their therapist mentioned the same thing, Marcus said. "She's working with Emma on learning to trust other adults to take care of Ethan. And Ethan has some delays that we're keeping an eye on," Mrs. Patterson continued. "His fine motor skills are behind where they should be for his age, and his reading level is significantly below grade level. But his artistic ability is remarkable. Has anyone ever had his work evaluated?" Marcus shook his head. In the chaos of getting the children settled and addressing their immediate needs, he hadn't thought to focus on Ethan's talents as much as his deficits. "I'd like to show some of his drawings to a friend of mine who works with gifted children," Mrs. Patterson said. "With your permission, of course." Sometimes children who have been through trauma express themselves through art in ways that can be incredibly healing. That evening, Marcus asked Ethan about his drawing and was surprised by the boy's passionate response. "I like to draw because it's quiet," Ethan explained, his words coming faster than usual as he warmed to the subject. "When I'm drawing, I don't have to think about scary things. I can make pictures of places I want to go, or people I want to meet, or animals that could be my friends." He showed Marcus a notebook he'd been keeping, filled with intricate drawings that displayed a level of detail and emotional depth that took Marcus's breath away. There were pictures of families sitting around dinner tables, children playing in sunny gardens, and animals that seemed to dance off the page with life and movement. "These are incredible, Ethan," Marcus said, meaning every word. "Have you always been able to draw like this?" Ethan nodded shyly. "Emma taught me when we were little. She said if we couldn't have nice things in real life, we could at least draw them and pretend." The matter-of-fact way he said it, the casual acceptance of deprivation as a normal part of childhood, made Marcus's chest ache. But he pushed down his anger and focused on the positive. "Well, now you can have nice things in real life and draw them too," Marcus said. "Would you like me to get you some better art supplies? Maybe some colored pencils and real drawing paper?" The way Ethan's face lit up was answer enough. That weekend, Marcus took both children to an art supply store, where Ethan moved through the aisles like he was in a cathedral, touching the displays of paints and brushes with reverent fingers. "Can I really choose anything I want?" he asked, his voice hushed with awe. "Within reason," Marcus said, smiling at the boy's wonder. "Pick out whatever you think you'll use." Ethan selected his supplies with the same careful consideration Emma had shown at the grocery store, choosing basic but quality items that would allow him to explore different artistic techniques. Marcus supplemented his choices with a few extras, including a set of watercolor paints that made Ethan gasp with delight. On the drive home, Emma was quieter than usual, staring out the window with a thoughtful expression. "What's on your mind?" Marcus asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Nothing," she said automatically, then seemed to reconsider. "It's just, why are you being so nice to us?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the disappointment and betrayal these children had experienced in their short lives. Marcus pulled into a parking lot and turned around to face both of them. "Because you deserve it," he said simply. "Because every child deserves to have adults in their life who care about their happiness and their future. Because you're not burdens or problems to be solved, you're people who matter." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But what if we mess up? What if we break something or get in trouble or cost too much money?" "Then we'll deal with it together," Marcus said. "That's what families do. They stick together through the good times and the bad times, even if we're not really your family." Ethan asked quietly. Marcus felt his heart clench at the vulnerability in the little boy's voice. "You are my family," he said firmly. "Maybe not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes the families we choose are stronger than the ones we're born into." That night, as Marcus tucked them into their beds, Emma grabbed his hand before he could. "Leave the room, Marcus," she said, her voice small in the darkness. "Yeah, I love you." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they represented such an enormous gift of trust from a child who had every reason to guard her heart carefully. "I love you too, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you, more than you'll ever know." As he closed their door and made his way to his own bedroom, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. His apartment felt warmer now, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the comfortable chaos of a growing family. His days had purpose beyond just surviving, and his future stretched ahead of him, filled with possibilities he had never imagined. But perhaps most importantly, he was beginning to understand what Sarah had tried to tell him in those final days before the cancer took her. Love, she had said, wasn't something you fell into by accident. It was something you chose. Every day, through action and intention and commitment. He had chosen to love these children, and they had chosen to love him back. And that choice was transforming all of them into the people they were meant to be. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by certified mail. That required Marcus's signature. Emma and Ethan were at their new school, something that had taken weeks of careful preparation and multiple meetings with counselors to arrange. The envelope bore the letterhead of Crawford Mills and Associates, a law firm from Dallas that Marcus had never heard of, and its official appearance made his stomach clench with dread. Marcus waited until he was alone in his apartment before opening it, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the crisp legal documents inside. The language was formal and intimidating, filled with whereas clauses and legal terminology that he had to read twice to understand, but the meaning was crystal clear. Someone was challenging his custody of Emma and Ethan. The plaintiffs were listed as Robert and Margaret Sullivan, described in the documents as the children's paternal grandparents. Marcus stared at the names, trying to process this new information. In all their conversations with social workers and therapists, neither Emma nor Ethan had ever mentioned grandparents. As far as everyone knew, they had no living relatives, which was why they had been placed in foster care in the first place. According to the legal filing, Robert and Margaret Sullivan claimed they had been searching for their deceased son's children for over 2 years, ever since learning of his death in a car accident. They alleged that the children had been wrongfully placed in the foster care system due to administrative errors and that they were the rightful guardians. The petition requested immediate custody transfer and painted Marcus as an unfit caregiver who had taken advantage of a bureaucratic mistake. Marcus sank into his kitchen chair, the papers scattered across the small table like pieces of a bomb that had just exploded in his carefully constructed world. Everything he had built with Emma and Ethan, every moment of trust and love and healing, was being threatened by two people he had never heard of who claimed a blood connection to the children. His first instinct was to call Janet Morrison, but he realized that the social worker might not be the ally he needed in this situation. If these grandparents had legitimate legal standing, Janet would be obligated to support reunification with blood relatives, regardless of what was best for Emma and Ethan. Instead, Marcus found himself reaching for his phone to call the one person he trusted most in the world. Tommy Chen speaking. His older brother answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him one of Houston's most respected family lawyers. "Tommy, it's Marcus. I need your help." There was a pause, during which Marcus could hear the surprise in his brother's silence. The two of them had been estranged for over a year, ever since a bitter argument about Marcus's handling of Sarah's death and his subsequent withdrawal from the family. Tommy had wanted Marcus to move back to Houston, to let their parents help him rebuild his life, but Marcus had chosen isolation instead. "Marcus, what's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm in trouble," Marcus said, cutting straight to the point. "Legal trouble. I need a lawyer, and I need someone I can trust." "Tell me everything," Tommy said, and Marcus could hear him settling into his professional mode. Marcus explained the situation as clearly as he could, starting with the night he had rescued Emma and Ethan from the Hendricks house and continuing through their placement with him and the gradual building of their family unit. Tommy listened without interruption, asking only clarifying questions that helped Marcus organize his thoughts. "And you're sure the children never mentioned these grandparents?" Tommy asked when Marcus finished. "Never, not once. Emma is incredibly protective of Ethan, and she's told me about every placement they've been in, every foster family that hurt them or failed them. If there were grandparents in the picture, she would have mentioned them." "That's concerning," Tommy said slowly. "If these people are legitimate relatives, there should have been some attempt at contact before now. The fact that they're appearing just as the children are finally stable suggests either gross negligence on the part of the system or something more deliberate." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, something more deliberate?" "I mean, someone might have been waiting for the right moment to make their move. Think about it, Marcus. If these grandparents had come forward while the children were being bounced between foster homes, they would have gotten two traumatized kids who needed expensive therapy and specialized care. But now that you've done the hard work of helping them heal, now that they're stable and thriving, suddenly grandparents appear to claim them." The implications of what Tommy was suggesting made Marcus feel sick. "You think they're lying?" "I think we need to investigate their claims very carefully," Tommy said. "Can you drive down to Houston this weekend? I want to meet these kids, and I want to start building a case for why maintaining their current placement is in their best interests." Marcus agreed, though the thought of telling Emma and Ethan about the legal challenge made his chest tight with anxiety. They had just started to believe that they were safe, that they had found a permanent home where they wouldn't be moved or separated or hurt. How could he explain that their newfound security was being threatened by strangers who claimed to love them? That afternoon, when the children returned from school, Marcus could see immediately that something was wrong. Emma's carefully controlled mask was back in place, and Ethan was clinging to her hand with the desperate grip he had used during their first days together. They moved through the apartment like they were walking on eggshells, hyper-vigilant in a way that took Marcus back to those early weeks when they had expected him to turn on them at any moment. "What happened at school?" Marcus asked gently, setting aside the legal documents that had consumed his day. "Nothing," Emma said automatically, but her voice was too tight, too controlled. Emma, Marcus said, sitting down so he was at their eye level. You know you can tell me anything, right? Whatever happened, we can deal with it together. Emma's carefully constructed composure cracked just a little. There was a woman at school today. She said she was from the state office, and she asked us questions about you. About whether you treat us well, whether we're happy here. Marcus felt his blood run cold. What kind of questions? She wanted to know if you ever hit us or yelled at us or made us do things we didn't want to do, Ethan said, his voice small and frightened. She kept asking the same things over and over, like she thought we were lying. And she had pictures, Emma added, her voice barely above a whisper. Pictures of an old man and woman that she said were our grandparents. She said they had been looking for us and that they wanted to take us home. The pieces clicked into place in Marcus's mind with horrifying clarity. The Sullivans weren't waiting for the legal system to work through proper channels. They were conducting their own investigation, going directly to the children in an attempt to gather evidence for their case. The fact that they had been allowed access to Emma and Ethan at school without Marcus's knowledge or consent suggested they had more resources and connections than he had initially realized. Did you recognize the people in the pictures? Marcus asked, though he was already certain of the answer. Both children shook their heads. I've never seen them before, Emma said. But the woman said our daddy was their son, and that they had rights to take care of us because we're their family. She said you weren't really our family because you're not our blood, Ethan added, tears starting to spill down his cheeks. She said people like you only take care of kids for the money, and that our real family would love us better. Marcus felt a surge of rage so intense it took all his self-control not to punch the wall. These people, whoever they were, had traumatized two children who had already been through more than any child should endure. They had undone weeks of careful progress, rebuilding the walls of fear and mistrust that had taken so long to tear down. Listen to me, Marcus said, reaching out to take both children's hands in his. I don't care what that woman said. You are my family, and I am yours. Not because of blood or legal papers, but because we chose each other. And I will fight for you with everything I have. But what if they make us go with them? Emma asked, her voice breaking. What if we don't have a choice? Then we'll face it together, Marcus said firmly. But I'm not going to let anyone take you away without a fight. I promise you that. That night, as Marcus lay awake listening to the soft sounds of the children talking quietly in their room, he made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to wait for the legal system to decide their fate. He was going to take control of the situation and fight for his family with everything he had. The next morning, Marcus called in sick to his auto shop and spent the day making phone calls. He contacted Emma and Ethan's teachers, their therapists, the community center where they spent their afternoons, and every professional who had been involved in their care. He asked each of them to document the children's progress, their emotional state, and their expressed preferences about their living situation. Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma therapist who had been working with both children, was particularly helpful. She agreed to write a detailed report about the potential psychological damage that could result from removing the children from their current stable placement, especially to place them with strangers who had no established relationship with them. These children have complex trauma histories, Dr. Kim explained during their phone conversation. They've learned to attach to Marcus as their primary caregiver, and that attachment is crucial to their ongoing healing. Disrupting it now could cause significant regression and might undo months of therapeutic progress. Marcus also reached out to Mrs. Patterson at the community center, who had been documenting Ethan's artistic development and Emma's academic achievements. She was appalled to learn about the legal challenge and immediately offered to serve as a character witness. Those children were barely speaking when they first arrived here, she told Marcus. Now Emma is reading at a high school level, and Ethan is creating art, that would impress professional artists. The transformation I've witnessed is nothing short of miraculous, and it's directly attributable to the stable, loving home you've provided. But perhaps the most important conversation Marcus had was with Janet Morrison, the social worker who had overseen the children's placement. When he explained the situation, Janet was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I have to be honest with you, Marcus," she said finally. "If these people can prove they're legitimate relatives, the law generally favors placement with biological family, but there are exceptions, especially when placement with relatives wouldn't be in the children's best interests." "What would I need to prove?" Marcus asked. "You'd need to demonstrate that the children's emotional and psychological well-being would be significantly harmed by removal from your care. You'd also need to show that you can provide better stability and care than the biological relatives. It's not impossible, but it's an uphill battle." "Janet," Marcus said, "these people approach the children at school without going through proper channels. They traumatize kids who were finally starting to heal. Does that sound like the behavior of loving grandparents to you?" Janet was quiet again. "No," she said slowly, "it doesn't. And I'll make sure that incident is documented in my report to the court." Over the weekend, Marcus drove Emma and Ethan to Houston to meet with Tommy. The children were nervous about the long car ride and the prospect of meeting another adult who would have power over their lives. But Marcus had prepared them as much as possible for what to expect. Tommy's law office was in a sleek downtown building that intimidated Marcus, even though he had visited it many times before. Emma and Ethan pressed close to his sides as they rode the elevator to the 14th floor, their eyes wide as they took in the marble floors and expensive artwork that decorated the hallways. Tommy greeted them in his conference room, having cleared his schedule for the entire afternoon. Marcus's brother was everything Marcus wasn't: polished, successful, comfortable in the world of money and power that Marcus had always found alienating. But as Tommy knelt down to shake hands with Emma and Ethan, Marcus saw the same gentleness that had made Tommy such an effective family lawyer. "I've heard a lot about you two," Tommy said, his voice warm and friendly. "Marcus tells me you're both pretty amazing kids." Emma, ever the protector, stepped slightly in front of Ethan. "Are you going to help us stay with Marcus?" she asked directly. Tommy smiled at her forthright approach. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you stay where you're happiest and safest. But first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Can you tell me about these people who claim to be your grandparents?" Over the next 2 hours, Tommy gently questioned both children about their family history, their memories of their father, and their experiences in the foster care system. What emerged was a picture that made the Sullivans' claims increasingly suspicious. Emma and Ethan remembered their father as a kind but troubled man who had struggled with addiction. They recalled him mentioning his parents occasionally, but always in negative terms, describing them as people who had cut him off and wanted nothing to do with him or his children. "Daddy said his parents thought we were mistakes," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He said they told him if he wanted to have kids with our mom, he was on his own." "Did your father ever try to contact them for help?" Tommy asked. "Once," Ethan said quietly, "when Daddy got really sick and couldn't work. He called them and asked if we could stay with them for a while, but they said no. They said they didn't want us." This testimony was crucial, Tommy explained to Marcus later, when the children were in the waiting room playing with toys he kept there for young clients. If the Sullivans had previously refused to help their own son and grandchildren, it would be much harder for them to claim they were loving relatives who deserved custody. "But there's something else bothering me about this case," Tommy said, reviewing the legal documents Marcus had brought. "The law firm representing the Sullivans is very expensive. We're talking about a practice that charges $1,000 an hour and typically handles complex corporate litigation. Why would grandparents seeking custody of their grandchildren need that level of legal firepower? Maybe they're wealthy?" Marcus suggested. Maybe, Tommy said, but his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. Or maybe there's more at stake here than just family reunification. I'm going to do some digging into the Sullivans' background, see what I can find out about their finances and their motivations. On the drive back to Millbrook, Emma and Ethan were quieter than usual, processing everything they had heard and experienced. As they neared home, Emma finally spoke up from the back seat. "Marcus, what happens if we have to go live with those people?" Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "But what if it does?" She persisted. "What if the judge says we have to go?" Marcus pulled over at a rest stop and turned around to face both children. "If that happens, which it won't, then I'll find a way to stay connected to you. I'll visit as much as they'll allow. I'll call you every day. I'll write letters. You'll never be alone, no matter what." "But it won't be the same," Ethan said, tears starting to fall. "You won't be our dad anymore." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Neither child had ever called him dad before, though he had hoped someday they might feel comfortable enough to do so. Hearing it now, in this context of potential loss, made his eyes burn with unshed tears. "I will always be your dad," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe not legally, maybe not officially, but in every way that matters. That's not something anyone can take away from us." Back in Millbrook, the next few weeks passed in a blur of legal preparations and increasing anxiety. Tommy worked tirelessly to build their case, gathering character witnesses, expert testimony, and evidence of the children's progress under Marcus's care. Meanwhile, the Sullivans' legal team began their own investigation, sending representatives to interview neighbors, teachers, and anyone else who might have information about Marcus's fitness as a guardian. The pressure was taking its toll on everyone. Marcus found himself snapping at customers at his auto shop, his concentration fractured by worry and sleepless nights. Emma's carefully controlled demeanor began to crack, and she started having nightmares again for the first time in months. Ethan regressed to some of his earlier behaviors, hoarding food and flinching when adults moved too quickly around him. Dr. Kim increased their therapy sessions and recommended that Marcus also start counseling to help him cope with the stress of the legal battle. But what helped more than anything was the outpouring of support from their community. Mrs. Patterson organized a letter-writing campaign, encouraging everyone who knew the family to write to the judge about the positive changes they had witnessed in the children. The owner of the diner where Marcus sometimes took the kids for weekend breakfast refused to accept payment for their meals anymore, saying it was the least she could do to help. Even Marcus's landlord, a gruff man who rarely spoke to his tenants, approached him to offer a character reference. "Those kids were like little ghosts when they first moved in," the landlord told Marcus. "Quiet, scared, barely there. Now I hear them laughing in the hallways, see them playing outside. Whatever you've done for them, it's made all the difference." But perhaps the most significant support came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks before the custody hearing, Marcus received a phone call from a woman named Rebecca Santos, who identified herself as a former social worker who had been involved in Emma and Ethan's case early in their time in foster care. "I've been following their case," Rebecca explained, "and I need to tell you something about those grandparents. I tried to contact the Sullivans myself about 2 years ago, when the children first entered the system. I found their contact information and reached out to see if they would be willing to take custody." Marcus felt his heart start to race. "What did they say?" "They weren't just uninterested," Rebecca said, her voice heavy with disgust. "They were actively hostile. Mr. Sullivan told me that his son was dead to him and that the children were not his problem. He said he didn't want to be contacted again about them ever. I documented the conversation in my case notes." This was the evidence Tommy had been hoping for. If the Sullivans had explicitly rejected the children when they were most in need, it would seriously undermine their current claims of loving concern. Rebecca agreed to testify about the conversation and to provide her original case notes as evidence. Why are they coming forward now? Marcus asked during a strategy session with Tommy the week before the hearing. I think I found the answer. To that, Tommy said, spreading a stack of documents across his conference table. I've been investigating the Sullivans' finances, and it turns out they're in serious trouble. Robert Sullivan owned a construction company that went bankrupt last year, and they've lost their house to foreclosure. They're currently living in a rental property and facing multiple lawsuits from creditors. So they're broke, Marcus said. But I still don't understand why they'd want custody of Emma and Ethan if they can't afford to take care of them. Tommy pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a life insurance company. Because Emma and Ethan's father had a life insurance policy that names them as beneficiaries. It's worth $500,000, and the money is being held in trust until they turn 18. But if the Sullivans are granted legal guardianship, they would have access to that money for the children's care and support. The pieces finally clicked into place. The Sullivans weren't trying to reunite with their grandchildren out of love or familial obligation. They were after the insurance money, willing to uproot two traumatized children from the only stable home they had ever known in order to solve their own financial problems. Can we prove that's their motivation? Marcus asked. I believe so, Tommy said. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. They ignore these children for years, even actively reject them when offered custody, and then suddenly develop grandparental instincts just as they're facing financial ruin. Any reasonable judge should see through that. But Marcus knew that. Family court could be unpredictable, and the law's preference for biological relatives was strong. Even with all their evidence and character witnesses, there was no guarantee that the judge would rule in their favor. The night before the hearing, Marcus found himself sitting on the edge of Emma and Ethan's bed, watching them sleep. They looked so peaceful, so innocent, completely unaware of the battle that would be fought over their future in just a few hours. Marcus had done everything he could to prepare, but now all he could do was wait and hope that love would be enough to overcome legal precedent and blood relations. Emma stirred in her sleep, reaching out instinctively for her brother's hand. Even unconscious, she was still protecting him, still making sure he wasn't alone. The gesture reminded Marcus of why he was fighting so hard. These children had already lost so much, had already been failed by so many adults who should have protected them. He couldn't let them down too. I love you both, he whispered into the darkness. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that you've made my life better in every possible way. As if she could hear him in her dreams, Emma smiled slightly and settled back into peaceful sleep. Marcus sat there for a long time, memorizing their faces and praying to whatever force controlled the universe that he would get to be their father for years to come. The courthouse in downtown Houston was an imposing structure of granite and glass that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered its halls. Marcus walked through the metal detectors with Emma and Ethan flanking him, their small hands gripping his with a desperation that broke his heart. Despite Tommy's careful preparation and all the evidence they had gathered, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a battle they might not win. Emma wore the navy blue dress that Marcus had bought her specifically for this day, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail that made her look older than her 8 years. Ethan was dressed in his first real suit, a small gray ensemble that Tommy had insisted would make the right impression on the judge. But despite their careful appearance, both children looked terrified, their eyes darting around the busy courthouse corridors as if expecting danger to emerge from every corner. Remember what we talked about, Marcus said quietly as they approached the family court waiting area. Tell the truth, speak clearly, and don't be afraid to say if you don't understand a question. Tommy met them outside the courtroom, his usually confident demeanor showing traces of the tension they were all feeling. Judge Martinez is fair but strict. he told Marcus in a low voice while the children sat nearby, looking through a picture book that neither of them was actually reading. She's been on the family court bench for 15 years, and she has a reputation for putting children's welfare above all other considerations. That works in our favor. What about the Sullivan's lawyer? Marcus asked, glancing toward the other side of the corridor, where a distinguished man in expensive suit was speaking with an elderly couple he assumed were Robert and Margaret Sullivan. Charles Whitfield, Tommy said grimly. He's good, I won't lie to you. He specializes in high-stakes custody cases, and he doesn't take cases he doesn't think he can win. But he's also arrogant, and arrogance can be a weakness if we play this right. Marcus studied the Sullivans from across the hallway, trying to reconcile their appearance with everything he had learned about them. Robert Sullivan was a tall, silver-haired man who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, while Margaret was a small, well-dressed woman whose smile seemed practiced rather than genuine. They looked like anyone's idea of ideal grandparents, which Marcus knew was exactly the impression they were trying to create. What struck him most was how they avoided looking in his direction or showing any interest in Emma and Ethan. If these were truly loving grandparents who had been searching for their lost grandchildren, wouldn't they be watching the children with joy or at least curiosity? Instead, they seemed more focused on their lawyer and the legal proceedings than on the two young lives that hung in the balance. The courtroom itself was smaller than Marcus had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a harsh, institutional feel. Judge Martinez was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, whose dark eyes seemed to miss nothing as the various parties took their seats. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table with Tommy, while Emma and Ethan were placed in a special section designated for minors, where a court-appointed advocate would stay with them throughout the proceedings. This matter concerns the custody of minor children, Emma Rose Sullivan and Ethan Michael Sullivan. Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying clearly through the small courtroom. The petitioners, Robert and Margaret Sullivan, seek to overturn the current placement and obtain legal guardianship as the biological grandparents of the children. The respondent, Marcus Chun, seeks to maintain the current custody arrangement. Mr. Whitfield, you may present your opening statement. Charles Whitfield stood and approached the bench with the confidence of a man who had argued hundreds of similar cases. He was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of aggressive bearing that Tommy had warned him about. Your Honor, Whitfield began, his voice smooth and persuasive. This case is fundamentally about correcting a grave injustice. My clients, Robert and Margaret Sullivan, are the loving grandparents of Emma and Ethan Sullivan, children who were wrongfully separated from their family due to bureaucratic incompetence and systemic failures within the child welfare system. Marcus felt his jaw clench as Whitfield painted a picture of the Sullivans as devastated grandparents who had been searching tirelessly for their grandchildren ever since learning of their son's death. According to Whitfield's version of events, the Sullivans had attempted to gain custody immediately, but had been thwarted by a system that had lost track of the children and placed them in a series of inappropriate foster homes. The children's current placement with Mr. Chun, while well-intentioned, represents a fundamental violation of their rights to be raised by their biological family, Whitfield continued. Mr. Chun, despite his good intentions, is a single man, with no experience raising children, no blood connection to Emma and Ethan, and no legal standing to maintain custody in the face of legitimate family claims. As Whitfield spoke, Marcus watched the judge's face carefully, trying to read her reaction to the arguments. Judge Martinez listened impassively, taking occasional notes but showing no obvious bias toward either side. When Whitfield finished his opening statement, she turned to Tommy with a slight nod. Tommy's approach was markedly different from his opponent's theatrical style. He spoke quietly and directly, focusing on facts rather than emotional appeals. Your Honor, Tommy said, the evidence will show that this case is not about family. reunification, or correcting bureaucratic errors. This is about two people who explicitly rejected these children when they were most in need, only to pursue custody now for reasons that have nothing to do with the children's welfare and everything to do with their own financial circumstances. Tommy outlined the evidence they would present, the documented conversation with Rebecca Santos, in which Robert Sullivan had refused custody and stated he wanted no contact with the children, the Sullivans' current financial difficulties, and the life insurance policy that would provide them with access to significant funds if they gained guardianship. Most importantly, Tommy continued, the evidence will show that Emma and Ethan Sullivan are thriving in their current placement. They have gone from traumatized, withdrawn children to confident, happy kids who are excelling academically and emotionally. Removing them from the only stable home they have ever known would be not just cruel, but potentially devastating to their psychological development. The first witness Whitfield called was Robert Sullivan himself. The older man took the stand with dignity, his voice steady as he answered questions about his relationship with his late son and his desire to care for his grandchildren. I loved my son David deeply, Robert testified, but he made choices that I couldn't support. His involvement with drugs, his relationship with a woman I felt was unsuitable, his general irresponsibility. These things created a rift between us that I deeply regret. Whitfield led him through a carefully crafted narrative of family estrangement and eventual reconciliation that never quite materialized before David's death. According to Robert's testimony, he and Margaret had tried to reconnect with their son multiple times but had been rebuffed by David's pride and stubbornness. When we learned of David's death and discovered that Emma and Ethan were in foster care, we immediately began searching for them, Robert continued. We hired private investigators, contacted multiple agencies, spent our own money trying to track them down. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. Marcus exchanged glances with Tommy during this testimony, both of them knowing that Rebecca Santos's evidence would directly contradict these claims. But they had to wait for cross-examination to present their side of the story. Margaret Sullivan's testimony was even more emotional, describing sleepless nights spent worrying about her grandchildren and her determination to provide them with the loving family environment they deserved. She spoke about the bedroom she had prepared for them in their home, the plans she had made for their education, and her vision of family holidays and traditions that would connect the children to their heritage. These children are the last connection we have to our son, Margaret said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We failed David in many ways, and we can't undo those mistakes. But we can make sure his children know they are loved and wanted by their family. It was a compelling performance, Marcus had to admit. If he hadn't known the truth about the Sullivans' financial motivations and their previous rejection of the children, he might have been moved by their apparent devotion to their grandchildren. The next witness was Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist that Whitfield had hired to evaluate the case. Dr. Williams testified about the importance of biological connections and family heritage in child development, arguing that children raised by relatives had better outcomes than those placed with unrelated caregivers. While Mr. Chun may provide adequate care, Dr. Williams stated, he cannot provide the genetic, cultural, and familial connections that are crucial to these children's identity formation. The psychological literature clearly shows that children who are separated from their biological families often struggle with issues of belonging and self-worth that persist into adulthood. Marcus felt his frustration building as the morning wore on. Everything the Sullivans' witnesses said sounded reasonable and professional, carefully crafted to present their clients in the best possible light, while subtly undermining his fitness as a guardian. By the time Judge Martinez called for the lunch recess, Marcus was beginning to wonder if their evidence would be strong enough to overcome the powerful narrative that Whitfield had constructed. During the break, Tommy and Marcus huddled in a small conference room with Emma and Ethan. who had been listening to the proceedings with growing anxiety. Emma's composure was beginning to crack, and Ethan had been crying quietly for most of the morning. "They're lying," Emma said flatly, her young voice filled with more anger than Marcus had ever heard from her. "I remember Daddy talking about his parents. He said they told him he was a disappointment and that they never wanted to see him again." "I know they're lying, sweetheart," Marcus said gently, "and this afternoon we're going to prove it. But I need you both to be strong for just a little while longer. What if the judge believes them?" Ethan asked, his voice small and frightened. "What if she makes us go live with them?" Marcus looked at Tommy, who gave a slight shake of his head. They had agreed not to make promises they couldn't keep, but seeing the terror in both children's eyes made it almost impossible to stick to that resolution. "Whatever happens," Marcus said carefully, "you need to know that this isn't your fault. Sometimes adults make decisions that don't make sense, but that doesn't mean you did anything wrong." The afternoon session began with Tommy calling his first witness, Rebecca Santos, the former social worker who had documented the Sullivans' rejection of the children. Rebecca was a middle-aged Hispanic woman whose years of experience in the child welfare system had given her a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect. "I contacted Robert Sullivan in March of 2022, Rebecca testified, reading from her case notes. "I explained that his grandchildren were in foster care following their father's death, and asked if he would be willing to provide a home for them." "And what was Mr. Sullivan's response?" Tommy asked. "He was very clear that he wanted nothing to do with the children. He said, and I quote from my notes, 'My son made his choices and now he's dead. Those kids are not my responsibility, and I don't want to be contacted about them again.'" The effect of this testimony on the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Marcus saw Judge Martinez's eyebrows rise slightly, and he noticed Whitfield frantically writing notes for his cross-examination. Most importantly, he saw the shocked expressions on the faces of several court staff members who had been listening to the Sullivans' emotional testimony all morning. Whitfield's cross-examination of Rebecca was aggressive but ultimately unsuccessful. He tried to suggest that she had misunderstood the conversation or taken Robert's words out of context, but Rebecca's detailed notes and unwavering testimony made it clear that there had been no misunderstanding. Tommy's next witness was Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma therapist who had been working with Emma and Ethan. Since their placement with Marcus, Dr. Kim's testimony focused on the children's remarkable progress and the potential psychological damage that could result from removing them from their current stable environment. "When I first met Emma and Ethan," Dr. Kim testified, "they exhibited classic symptoms of complex trauma. Emma was hypervigilant and parentified, taking on adult responsibilities for her brother's care. Ethan was selectively mute and showed signs of developmental regression. Both children had severe attachment issues and demonstrated the kind of wariness and distrust that comes from repeated abandonment and abuse." Dr. Kim went on to describe the gradual healing process that had taken place under Marcus's care, highlighting specific milestones and breakthrough moments that demonstrated the strength of the attachment bond between Marcus and the children. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Kim concluded, "removing these children from their current placement would constitute a form of re-traumatization that could undo months of therapeutic progress. The attachment they have formed with Mr. Chun is not only healthy but crucial to their continued healing." Whitfield's cross-examination attempted to portray Dr. Kim as biased in favor of Marcus, but her professional credentials and detailed treatment notes made her testimony nearly unassailable. More importantly, she was able to speak directly to the children's expressed wishes about their living situation. "Both Emma and Ethan have consistently expressed their desire to remain with Mr. Chun," Dr. Kim stated. "Emma has told me repeatedly that Marcus is the first adult who has ever made her feel truly safe, and Ethan has begun referring to Marcus as his father in our sessions." The afternoon continued with a parade of character witnesses who testified. about Marcus's dedication to the children and the positive changes they had observed. Mrs. Patterson spoke about the children's progress at the community center. Their teachers described their academic improvements, and neighbors testified about the loving family atmosphere they had witnessed. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Janet Morrison, the social worker who had overseen the children's placement with Marcus. Janet's professional experience and her intimate knowledge of the case made her an ideal witness to speak about what was truly in the children's best interests. "I have been a social worker for 18 years, Janet testified, and I have rarely seen a placement work as well as this one has. Mr. Chun has exceeded every expectation we had when we granted him emergency custody. He has provided not just adequate care, but exceptional care that has allowed these children to heal and thrive." Janet went on to describe the extensive background checks and home studies that had been conducted, all of which had supported Marcus's suitability as a guardian. She also testified about the children's expressed preferences and their obvious emotional bond with Marcus. "In my professional opinion," Janet concluded, "removing Emma and Ethan from Mr. Chun's care would be contrary to their best interests and potentially harmful to their emotional and psychological development." As the day wore on, Marcus could see that the momentum in the courtroom was shifting. The Sullivans' carefully constructed narrative was being systematically dismantled by witness after witness, who testified about Marcus's fitness as a guardian and the children's obvious happiness in their current placement. The final witness of the day was Marcus himself. Tommy had prepared him extensively for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the emotional weight of speaking about his love for Emma and Ethan in front of a room full of strangers who would decide their fate. "I never intended to become a father," Marcus testified, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "When I heard those children crying that night, I just knew I couldn't walk away. I couldn't leave them in danger." Tommy led him through the story of how he had come to care for Emma and Ethan, from that first night at the Hendricks house through the gradual building of trust and love that had transformed all their lives. Marcus spoke about the challenges they had faced together, the small victories and breakthrough moments that had marked their journey as a family. "These children have taught me what it means to be a father," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because of biology or legal documents, but because of the choice we made to love and care for each other. They've made me a better person, and I hope I've given them the safety and stability they needed to heal." Whitfield's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on Marcus's lack of experience with children, his financial limitations, and his inability to provide the children with the extended family connections that the Sullivans could offer. But Marcus had been well prepared for these attacks, and he answered each question with calm honesty that seemed to resonate with Judge Martinez. "Mr. Chun," Whitfield said at one point, "isn't it true that you make less than $40,000 a year from your auto repair shop? How can you claim to provide better opportunities for these children than my clients, who have significantly greater financial resources?" "Money isn't everything," Marcus replied quietly. "Emma and Ethan don't need expensive things. They need someone who will love them unconditionally, who will be there for them when they have nightmares, who will celebrate their achievements and support them through their failures. They need someone who sees them as blessings, not burdens." The final dramatic moment of the day came when Judge Martinez announced that she wanted to speak with Emma and Ethan privately in her chambers. This was something Tommy had prepared them for, but Marcus could see the fear in both children's eyes as they were led away by the court advocate. For 45 minutes, Marcus sat in the courtroom with Tommy, trying not to imagine what questions the judge might be asking the children, or how they might be responding. Everything they had worked for, everything they had built together, might depend on what Emma and Ethan said in that small, intimidating room. When the children finally returned, Emma's eyes were red from crying, but her expression was determined. Ethan looked exhausted, but seemed calmer than he had been all day. They took their seats without looking at anyone, and Marcus had no way of knowing what they had told the judge. Judge Martinez returned to the bench and announced that the court would be in recess until the following morning, when she would deliver her decision. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Another night of uncertainty, another sleepless night of worrying about whether he would wake up tomorrow still able to call himself Emma and Ethan's father. As they gathered their things to leave the courthouse, Marcus noticed that the Sullivans were speaking intensely with their lawyer, their faces showing the first signs of concern he had seen from them all day. Whitfield was shaking his head and gesturing emphatically, clearly not pleased with how the proceedings had gone. Outside the courthouse, in the humid Houston evening, Marcus finally had a chance to speak privately with Emma and Ethan about their conversation with the judge. "She asked us who we wanted to live with," Emma said simply. "And we told her." "What did you tell her?" Marcus asked gently. "The truth," Ethan said, slipping his small hand into Marcus's larger one. "We told her you're our dad and we want to stay with you forever." That night, in their hotel room, Marcus lay awake listening to the children's breathing and thinking about everything that had been said in court. The evidence had been strong, the witnesses compelling, and the children's wishes clear. But family court was unpredictable, and blood relationships carried weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. Whatever happened tomorrow, Marcus knew that he had fought as hard as he could for his family. He had told the truth, presented the evidence, and trusted in a system that didn't always make decisions that made sense. Now all he could do was wait and hope that love would be enough to overcome legal precedent and financial motivations. As dawn broke over Houston, Marcus Chun prepared to learn whether he would continue to be a father, or whether two children, who had already lost so much, would lose the only stable home they had ever known. The weight of that uncertainty was almost unbearable, but it was nothing compared to his determination to protect Emma and Ethan from any more pain than they had already endured. The final day of the custody hearing would determine not just where two children would live, but whether justice and love could triumph over money and legal technicalities. Marcus had done everything he could to prepare for this moment, but now the decision rested in the hands of a judge who held the power to destroy or preserve the family they had fought so hard to build. Judge Martinez entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning, her expression revealing nothing about the decision she was about to deliver. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched her settle behind the bench, organize her papers, and look out over the assembled crowd with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to everyone's soul. Emma and Ethan sat in their designated section, holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Both children looked like they hadn't slept any better than Marcus had, their young faces drawn with exhaustion and anxiety. Across the courtroom, the Sullivans maintained their composed facade, though Marcus noticed that Margaret's hands were trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "This court must determine what arrangement best serves the interests of Emma Rose Sullivan and Ethan Michael Sullivan." Marcus held his breath, every muscle in his body tense as he waited for the words that would either confirm his family or tear it apart forever. The law traditionally favors placement with biological relatives when such placement is available and appropriate, the judge continued. However, this court must also consider the children's current well-being, their expressed preferences, and the circumstances surrounding any family reunification. Judge Martinez paused, looking directly at the Sullivans. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, while I acknowledge your legal standing as biological grandparents, the evidence presented raises serious concerns about your motivations and commitment to these children's welfare." Marcus saw Robert Sullivan's face flush red as the judge continued. "The documented evidence shows that you explicitly rejected custody of these children when they were first placed in care, stating unequivocally that you wanted no responsibility for them. Your sudden interest in guardianship, coinciding with your financial difficulties and knowledge of the children's inheritance, suggests motivations that are not in their best interests. Margaret Sullivan's composure finally cracked, and she began crying quietly into her tissue. Her husband's jaw was clenched so tightly that Marcus could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. Furthermore, Judge Martinez said, turning toward Marcus, the evidence clearly demonstrates that Emma and Ethan have thrived under Mr. Chun's care in ways that exceed every reasonable expectation. They have gone from traumatized, withdrawn children to confident, happy individuals who are excelling academically and emotionally. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but he forced himself not to celebrate yet. He had seen too many legal proceedings take unexpected turns to trust in victory before it was officially declared. Most importantly, the judge continued, these children have expressed their clear, unwavering preference to remain with Mr. Chun, whom they consider their father in every meaningful sense of the word. This court will not ignore the voices of children who have already endured too much instability and loss. Judge Martinez looked directly at Emma and Ethan, her stern expression softening slightly. Emma and Ethan, I want you to know that this decision is about making sure you have the best possible future. The adults in this room may disagree about what that looks like, but you are the ones who matter most. Marcus felt tears stinging his eyes as the judge delivered her final ruling. Therefore, this court denies the petition for custody transfer and grants permanent guardianship to Marcus Chun, with full legal rights and responsibilities as the children's adoptive father. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Tommy grabbed Marcus's shoulder with a grip that would leave bruises, while behind them, Marcus could hear the Sullivan's lawyer already talking about appeals. But all Marcus could focus on were Emma and Ethan, who had broken free from their court advocate and were running toward him with expressions of pure joy that made his heart feel like it might burst. He caught them both in his arms, lifting them off the ground as they wrapped themselves around him like they never intended to let go. Emma was crying and laughing at the same time, while Ethan kept repeating, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," in a voice thick with relief and happiness. "We're going home," Marcus whispered into their hair, his own tears flowing freely now. "We're going home together, and nobody can ever take that away from us." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the backyard of their new house, watching Emma teach a group of neighborhood children how to plant vegetables in the garden they had built together. The small ranch-style home wasn't fancy, but it had 3 bedrooms, a real yard, and enough space for a growing family to spread out and breathe. The auto shop had become surprisingly successful after word spread about Marcus's story. Customers started coming, not just for car repairs, but because they wanted to support a man who had fought so hard for his children. Marcus had been able to hire an assistant and expand his services, finally achieving the financial stability that had eluded him for so long. Ethan had set up an art studio in the converted garage, where his paintings and drawings covered every available wall surface. His work had progressed so dramatically that Mrs. Patterson had arranged for him to display several pieces in a local gallery's youth showcase. The shy, traumatized little boy who had once flinched at every loud noise was now confident enough to explain his artistic process to curious visitors. Emma had tested into the gifted program at their new school and was already talking about wanting to become a lawyer like Uncle Tommy so she could help other kids who needed someone to fight for them. Her protective instincts had evolved into a fierce advocacy for justice that made Marcus proud every single day. The legal battle had officially ended when the Sullivans' appeal was denied, but Marcus knew the real victory was measured in smaller moments. It was Emma sleeping through the night without nightmares. It was Ethan calling him dad without hesitation. It was the way both children had learned to trust that love didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. Dr. Kim had eventually reduced their therapy sessions to monthly check-ins, marveling at the children's resilience and continued progress. The trauma would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined their future. They had learned that being abandoned didn't make them unlovable, and that sometimes the people who choose you can love you more fiercely than those who share your blood. Marcus had framed the adoption papers and hung them in the hallway next to school photos and artwork, tangible proof that their family was real and permanent and protected by law. But the real proof was in the way Emma automatically set 3 places at the dinner table. The way Ethan signed his school papers with Chun written in careful block letters, and the way both children had stopped looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next disaster to strike. That evening, as they sat around their kitchen table sharing stories about their day, Marcus looked at his children and marveled at the unlikely chain of events that had brought them together. If he hadn't driven past the Hendricks house that night, if he hadn't heard the children crying, if he hadn't found the courage to act when action was needed, none of this would exist. "Dad," Emma said, interrupting his thoughts, "Mrs. Patterson called today. She said there's a new kid at the community center who's been asking about our family. He wants to know how we all found each other." Marcus smiled, recognizing the tone in Emma's voice that meant she was working up to asking for something important. "Oh, really? And what did you tell Mrs. Patterson?" "I told her we'd think about maybe having him over for dinner sometime," Emma said carefully. "You know, just to show him that good families exist. That kids like us can find homes where people actually want us." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "He draws pictures like I used to draw. Sad pictures. Maybe he needs to see that families can be happy." Marcus felt his heart expand with pride at his children's instinctive desire to help another child in need. They had taken the pain of their own experiences and transformed it into empathy and compassion for others. It was exactly the kind of people he had hoped they would become. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Marcus said. "Why don't you invite him over this weekend? We can show him Emma's garden and Ethan's art studio. Maybe he'll want to help us plant the fall vegetables." Both children beamed with excitement, already making plans for how to welcome their potential new friend. Marcus listened to their chatter and thought about how far they had all come from that cold night, when 3 broken people had found each other and decided to build something beautiful together. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Marcus stood in his workshop behind the house, tinkering with a project he had been working on for weeks. It was a wooden toy chest painted in bright blues and yellows, with Emma and Ethan's names carved carefully into the lid. Inside, he planned to store all the mementos from their journey together. The first drawings Ethan had made in their old apartment, the report cards from Emma's first semester at their new school, photos from their first real Christmas together. But most importantly, he planned to include a letter he had written to them both, explaining how they had saved him just as much as he had saved them. How loving them had taught him that family wasn't about perfect circumstances or traditional structures, but about showing up for each other day after day, through good times and bad times, no matter what the world threw at you. As Marcus worked, he could hear the soft murmur of Emma and Ethan talking quietly in their shared bedroom, the kind of peaceful conversation that came from children who felt safe enough to dream about the future. The sound filled him with a contentment he had never thought possible, a sense of completeness that made every struggle worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that the love they had built together was strong enough to weather any storm. But tonight, Marcus Chun was simply a father putting the finishing touches on a gift for his children, grateful beyond measure for the unlikely miracle that had transformed 3 lost souls into an unbreakable family. The workshop was quiet, except for the gentle sound of sandpaper against wood and the distant laughter of 2 children who had finally learned what it meant to be home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.